بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين وبه نستعين والصلاة والسلام على رسوله الكريم سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم وفقنا لكل عمل تحب وترضاه يا رب العالمين. وبعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. There is an action that was feared most by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He feared this action most for himself, and he also feared it the most from his ummah. And this action is, if only it was something visible, but it's not the case. It's not something that you can sense, see, and hear. This action is an action of the heart, and an action in which only the doer can ever be aware of it. And it is an action which is feared most by the Prophet ﷺ for many reasons. One of the main reasons is because it is that action in which it will render the thing that you have done, the good deeds that you have done, null and void. And that action is ar-riya. Ar-riya. Ar-riya is diametrically opposed to tawheed. We are people of La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. We are people of tawheed. We are people of oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is one, and that there is no associating partners with Him in worship, in divinity, in aggrandizement, in anything that you associate with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Nothing is to be apportioned to any of His creation, anything else. And so our actions, every single part of our being is directed and focused towards Him. وَمَا أُمِرُوا إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُوا اللَّهَ مُخْلِصِينَ لَهُ الدِّينَ. Everything is directed towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So, Riya is diametrically opposed to Tawheed. Because Riya is, what is the definition of Riya? Is doing things to show others. Not for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but doing it for some form of recognition from somebody else. Whatever that action is. Whether it is your ibadah, you are doing it so that other people can recognize your religiosity. Whether that is giving in sadaqah, you want people to recognize that you are wealthy, and that you can afford to give to others. You can afford to buy other things. There could be even the mundane actions of feeding others, right? Buying food, the clothes that you wear, to show others that, your fashion sense, how much wealth you have, etc., etc., etc. Anything that is done for other than the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? That is supposed to be associated or directed to Allah, which is all of our being, right? قُلْ إِنَّ صَلَاتِي وَنُسُكِي وَمَحْيَايَ وَمَمَاتِي لِلَّهِ رَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ لَا شَرِيكَ لَهُ وَبِذَلِكَ أُمِرْتُ. Right? The statement of Ibrahim alayhi salam, that say, verily, that my prayer, my sacrifice, my worship, my life and my death, that I do. And this is what I have been commanded to do. Right? So we are upon the way of Ibrahim alayhi salam in our tawheed, in our oneness. Everything that we do is directed towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's so abstract, right? In our world today, what does it mean to direct our actions towards Allah? Okay, when we come to the masjid, when we conduct ourselves with our deen, when we pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when we carry out our salah, when the month of Ramadan comes, everything is clear, everything is for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But in everyday life, in everything else, what does it mean to direct ourselves to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? If it is our sacrifices, if it is our living and our dying, everything is for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what does that mean? How do we direct ourselves to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Right? One of the easiest ways to do that, and one of the best ways to start in recognizing tawheed in your life, is understanding that there is a negative value to that statement and applying that negative value. We have to remember that Tawheed is La ilaha illallah, that there is no other deity worthy of worship, right? So when you negate things from your life, when you take things out of your life, you are slowly alleviating yourself from the baggage of what is impeding you and actualizing Tawheed in your life. Yeah? And one of the first things that you take out is Riya. Because that is the thing that is directly opposed to Tawheed. When you pray, when you come to the masjid and you pray in a way that you don't normally pray when you're at home. You pray in a way that you don't normally pray when others can't see you. When others can't see you, just knock it out quickly. When others can see you, it's like, no, let me just take my time. Otherwise they're going to say that I'm not doing my sujood properly. Right? Make it just a little bit longer. Make my sujood just a little bit longer. Slowly go through the motions. Right? Now the thing about Riyah is that no one else can see this except you. Anybody else looking at you is saying, will say that this man, mashallah, or this woman, mashallah, is praying to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the best of prayers. And I wish that I had a prayer like hers or his. Right? So the outward action doesn't change. But the inward action is, the action of the heart is what is the focus. Now it's interesting to note is that Islam, in its literature, always talks about actions of the heart when it comes to like things like Riyah, when it comes to things like jealousy, anger, when it comes to happiness, and so on and so forth. These are all actions of the heart, right? And the reason why it's associated with the heart is because the heart is where your niyyah is, the heart is where your ruh comes from, and so on and so forth, right? So there is a strong connection between the heart and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There is a strong connection between your tawheed and your heart. But here in Western literature, it's very much different, right? These sorts of emotions and feelings are connected to chemical reactions in your body. So happiness is related to dopamine in your brain, sadness and anger, jealousy even, they're all related to chemical reactions in your body. So based on those chemical reactions, that is what the associated emotion will be linked to. So it has no association with the heart whatsoever, right? And when it has no association with the heart whatsoever, it's freed from that connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when it's freed from that connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there is no concept of morality connected to that emotion anymore. It's just the way you feel. And you're never wrong for the way you feel, right? But when it's connected to the heart, there's a level of accountability. There's a level of self-control. You now have to control this emotion that you feel. You now have to control this feeling that's going on in your heart, that's going on inside it. You can't quite explain, that you can't tell anybody about, because there are no words to describe it. If you were to describe how you're doing Riyah, how are you going to describe it, right? If you're going to describe your hasad, how are you supposed to describe it? It can only be described with that outward action, right? So Riyah isn't an outward action, it's an inward action. And that's what makes it so difficult. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ feared it the most. Another reason why the Prophet ﷺ feared this action the most. أَخْوَفُ مَا أَخَافُ عَلَىٰ أُمَّتِي الشِّرْكِ الْخَفِيِّ. Prophet ﷺ called it shirk al-khafi. The thing that I fear the most for my ummah is hidden shirk. Riyah is hidden shirk. And Riyad al-Salihin, Imam al-Nawawi, he brings the chapter of Bab Tahrim al-Riyah, the chapter that prohibits Riyah, showing off, doing actions outwardly in order to gain credit for that action from others. When he brings this chapter, it is amazing how the hadith that he brings in this chapter, the ayat that he brings in this chapter, are so closely associated to what Sulaiman just said, right? And nifaq. And the qawm that unfortunately we are part of, right? And the times that we unfortunately live in at the moment, the biggest instigator or the biggest sort of catalyst is in terms of your actions, in terms of your character, in terms of everything that we see on TV, on the news, and so on and so forth, nifaq. People saying that which they don't do. People professing that which they have no association with whatsoever. People promising that which they can't deliver. Right? We've had this all before, right? We see politicians all the time sitting on the TV saying, I'm going to promise you X, Y, Z, and when the time comes, none of that is to be seen. And perhaps they're not at fault because they have absolutely no control of what they're going to deliver and what they're not going to deliver, but at the same time, they are promising things that they can't deliver, right? We live in a society where the negative facets of the human character are constantly pushed, constantly encouraged. You have to have a level of hasad, of jealousy, right, and envy in order to peddle the capitalist system. In order for me to make you want to buy something, I have to make you envy someone who already has that thing, to make you want it, right? So I have to push this characteristic in you, that you have to be envious towards others. You have to be covetous in order for me to sell you the products that I want you to sell. The Prophet ﷺ, he said that التُّجَّارُ هُمُ الْفُجَّارُ إِلَّا مَنْ بَرَّ وَصَدَقَ. That tradesmen, right, the people who buy and sell, they are the true evildoers. SubhanAllah. I wondered about this hadith for so many years. I was like, how could just earning a living, man, right? Going about your business, trying to earn some money, right? And suddenly you're fujjar. And fujjar comes from the word fujur, right? Fujur means evil doings, things that are immoral, things that are bad, things that lead to Jahannam. So how is it that tradesmen, how is it that people who buy and sell businessmen, how is it that they are fujjar? Obviously there is an exception, except those who barra wa sadaq, those who act righteously and they give in sadaqah, right? So they give from their wealth to those who need it. Now the reason why that is because, or one of the reasons perhaps, right, don't quote me on this, inshallah, but this is one of the things that I've heard from my teachers and I've come to myself, is that the businessman, the person who's trying to sell you something, he doesn't care in what means you buy this thing, whether it's done in truth, whether it's done out of necessity, whether you actually need it or you don't need it, whether it's something that is pure or impure, whether it is halal or haram. I don't care. As long as you buy it, as long as you exchange something of value for this product, I'm happy, right? And at the end of the day, I have to, be at a certain sort of level with regards to my incomings and outgoings. And I always have to be on the surplus, right? That's the bottom line. The bottom line is the most important part. So as long as I'm getting money, alhamdulillah, I'm happy. And I don't care whether I lie to you just a little white lie and tell you that this is something that's genuine and it's not actually genuine, right? You can't buy this thing anywhere, but you can actually get it down the road, right? Doesn't matter what I do, it doesn't matter how I tell you it, as long as I get the sale, right? So this is the kind of world that we're living in today, right? And these are the people that run the world at the moment, right? It's not run by governments and politicians, it's run by major corporations that are assumingly trying to sell us something but not actually selling us anything, right? But anyway, it's a side note. So this sort of element of, let's go back to Riyah, inshallah. The element of Riyah, doing things that you don't, that you want recognition for, closely associated, as Imam al-Nawawi puts it in Riyadh al-Salihin, closely associated to nifaq. Doing things, saying things, that which you do not do, that which you do not have, that which you do not profess or actually, have in your repertoire of actions. We know that we fall into one of three categories in life. Either we are believers, right? In the beginning of Surah Al-Baqarah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala lays this out quite nicely. Either we are from the category of believers, those people who do things for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who have sincerity, who have integrity, who have tawheed in their very essence, in everything that they do. Or we fall in the category of the disbelievers, those who are completely the opposite. And not opposite in the sense that they profess something that they don't actually have, rather they openly profess, now, you know what, we don't care about those values, we don't care about those things, we are on this path here that goes towards a different destination. And the third category is the category of in-betweeners. They profess to be good, they profess to have all these wonderful characteristics, but inside they don't actually have it. Now, the reason why Riyah is so important as an action to alleviate ourselves from is, like we said before, it impedes us from actualizing Tawheed in our lives, actualizing Tawheed in our very being, in our actions, and so on and so forth. And one of the things that it does also is that it renders our actions null and void. لا تبطلوا صدقاتكم بالمن والأذى كالذي ينفق ماله رئاء الناس. Yeah? do not render your actions null and void. You yourself, do not render your actions null and void. What action is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talking about here? He's talking about sadaqah. Do not render your sadaqah null and void. How? By following up your sadaqah with manni wal adha. Man is when you've done something good for someone and you want to remind them of that good. Bro, I gave you that loan of like £1,000. Remember that? I was helping you out. I got your back. And you're just like, bro, why you gotta remind me of that? I took that in times of need. And other is when you say a bad word, right? When you follow that with an insult. Whether that's immediately afterwards, like you give sadaqah and then you're like, poor man, right? Or whether it's years later. Whatever the case may be, if the action of sadaqah is followed by one of those two things, that's null and void. كَالَّذِي يُنْفِقُ مَالَهُ رِيَاءَ النَّاسِ. Just like that, a person who spends in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he gives in sadaqah or he spends his wealth only to show people that he is spending his wealth. SubhanAllah. Exactly the same category. His actions, null and void. So it's important that we alleviate ourselves from this. One of the ways that we can do this is by rectifying our niyyah, rectifying our intention. And the only way in which we can rectify our intention is to have that intention alive with us whilst we are doing the action. Before we do it, whilst we are doing it, and after we have done it. In order to do that, we have to have a level of consciousness and awareness of what we are doing. Right? إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ وَلِكُلِّ إِمْرِئٍ مَا نَوَى, right? That every action is by your intention and every person will have what they intended. If all of our actions are by our intentions, are accepted based on our intentions, then everything that we do, right, is based on that. And everything we do is accepted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or rejected by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So if everything that we do has an association with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, everything that we do has to have a niyyah behind it. Whether that is eating, drinking, why else would we say Bismillah before we eat? Right? The sunnah of the Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Why else before we go to the toilet? Right? There is a dua before you go to the toilet. Right? Allahumma inni a'udhu bika min al-khubthi wal-khaba'ith. Right? There's no point of saying these things unless there is an intention associated with this action. Right? So actions are by intention. So rectify your intention. That means that you have to have a consciousness with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in everything that you do. In order to have a consciousness with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you have to be in a state of remembrance. So, what's the next thing? Niyyah is the first thing. The second thing is dhikr. You have to be in a state of dhikr. Right? And dhikr doesn't mean you take a sibha, sit in the masjid, subhanallah, 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 subhanallah. Right? Doesn't mean that you have something that you're counting. To be in a state of remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't mean that you're necessarily saying anything. That helps. That is the biggest stimulus in order to stay connected with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that is why it is the sunnah of the Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam to have these awrad. Morning and evening, he will say something like 100 times. He'll say like subhanallah, subhanallah wa bihamdihi, subhanallah al-azim 100 times. In the morning and the evening. Right? To stay connected. Between the morning and the evening, do you think he's not saying these things? Do you think he's not thinking these things? Alayhi salatu wasalam. So stay in a state of dhikr. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to, because at the beginning it's always difficult, right? That you always have to stay consciously connected, right? You have so many things going on in your life. You have work, you have families, you have other hobbies on the side that you do, right? Things to busy yourself with. How is it amongst all of those things we are supposed to stay in a state of dhikr and connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Focused on Allah. Because if you focus on that, then you're not focused on the work that you're doing right in front of you. And if you're not focused on the work that you're doing right in front of you, that goes haba'an manthura, and you've wasted your time, and you haven't achieved anything other than saying a few words. So being in a state of dhikr doesn't mean that you're stopping yourself from doing any of these actions. Even if you are doing these actions and they take precedence and they take the majority of your thought process, right? But you're still saying the motions, going through the motions, subhanallah, subhanallah, bihamdihi, subhanallah. And then when you're driving, for example, right? You're on the road, you've got to stay focused, yeah? Otherwise, after this khutbah, we're going to have loads of insurance claims. So when you're driving, being in a state of dhikr, even in that, it's mashallah very beneficial. But at the same time, you're focusing on the road. Being in that state itself is praiseworthy. Is a step in the right direction. Is a step in towards being connected with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? Ibn Ata'illah al-Sakandari, rahimahullah, he says in his hikam that being in a state of dhikr, even whilst you are heedless of that dhikr, is better than not being in a state of dhikr at all. Right? So you're driving, you're not doing any dhikr. You have no association with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at all while you're driving. You're just focusing on the road, listening to LBC, LCB, what is it? I didn't listen to them. Right? Your focus is elsewhere. That state, fine, no problem. But it is nowhere near being in a state of dhikr, saying subhanallah wa bihamdihi, even if you are not wholeheartedly connected to those words. But you are still in a state of dhikr, you're still doing it. Why? Because that will eventually lead you to, inshallah, if you're constant in that, that will lead you to being in a state of dhikr consciously, all the time. And you'll find a way. And there's no way to describe that in words. Right? It is a state of being that is so beautiful that I don't think there are words to describe it, except they'll do it in injustice and be like, Imam, what are you talking about? So it is something that you experience. And we are ahl al-tajriba. We are people who experience things. We're not people who just say things because they're said or because they're written in books and we just take them in and regurgitate them. It has to be a level of experience. Otherwise the Quran is going to be alien to us. And slowly, as time goes by, there are elements of the Quran that become more and more alien. There are elements of the Sunnah that become more and more strange. Why? Because they are not practiced. If they are practiced, we recognize the hikmah, recognize the wisdoms, we understand. But when they are not practiced, it just goes over our heads and we don't understand anything. So, rectifying our attentions. Being in a state of dhikr, whether that is consciously or unconsciously at the beginning, but being in that state. These are the tools that we are going to need, inshallah, to alleviate ourselves from being in this state of riyā. And that we focus our actions, whether they are deen related or dunya related, for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the more we do that, the more we are readying ourselves to acquire and attain the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The more we are readying ourselves to acquire more of the sunnah of the Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. The more we are readying ourselves to follow in the footsteps of the Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And the more that, the way of life of the Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam is not so distant that it's unattainable. And the more we do that, brothers and sisters, the more we are not affected by the society around us, the more we are able to safeguard our iman in times of godlessness and in times of immorality. We are able to safeguard that for ourselves and for our children as well. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم ولسائر المسلمين فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. Inshallah, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us the tawfiq and the ability to alleviate ourselves from riyā in all its forms. May He make us those who rectify ourselves and rectify our intentions. And may He allow us and grant us the tawfiq and the ability to constantly be in His remembrance. Jazakumullahu khairah for listening, everybody at home. You may now pray your dhuhr. Wassalamu alaikum.